In this video, I'm going to talk about manual imagery analysis. Manual interpretation and analysis began at the start of remote sensing and aerial photography interpretation. Digital processing and analysis is more recent, beginning with the advancement of computer technology. In general, manual interpretation requires little, if any, specialized equipment. It's normally limited to analyzing a single band or image at a time because it's hard to visually interpret multiple images at once. On the contrary, digital analysis requires specialized and often expensive equipment, but allows the analysis of much larger, complex images, sometimes many at a time, much faster than people can manually do. Manual interpretation is also more of a subjective process than computer analysis and is likely to be more accurate due to its reduction of human-caused error. That being said, it's important to note that manual and digital analysis are not mutually exclusive, with each having their own benefits and limitations. However, in most cases, both methods are used. Computers are getting smarter, but they still can't replace the human brain. And even after a digital analysis is run, humans still have to validate it. Thanks to companies like Google for Google Maps, people are much more familiar with viewing images taken from a bird's eye view now than they have been ever throughout history. However, imagery interpretation is a bit more difficult than normal everyday visual interpretations. This is because the view is often unfamiliar, as the image is taken at varying scales. They can lack the detail required to accurately identify objects. They can include wavelengths not visible to the human eye, and they're only two-dimensional. So in order to more accurately interpret the images, you will need to take the elements of tone, shape, size, pattern, texture, shadow, and association into account. We already do all this naturally, often without realizing it. Now we're just putting words to it. Tone refers to the relative brightness or color of the objects in an image. It is the primary element that distinguishes the different features, and is probably the first thing you notice. Changes in tone also allow us to see changes in other visual elements. In the image on the slide, the first thing I notice is the difference between the light browns and dark greens. What can you infer about the locations in the image based solely on the differences between the tones, particularly the browns and greens? If I were to interpret this image, I would venture to guess that this image is taken in the summer or during the dry portion of the year. I would also hypothesize that the people primarily live in the green areas and that the light brown areas are largely vacant. It's also possible that the green areas are family farms or agriculture. How did I come to these conclusions? Because this is a true color image, the light brown is probably bare earth, while the green is vegetation. Because the differences in colors are so distinct, I don't think they are naturally occurring. If the image was taken during the wet part of the year, or in an area where it rains more frequently, there would likely be more vegetation that would be spread throughout the images, making it look more green overall. The dark green areas are probably irrigated, and that only happens where the people are. Shape refers to the form, structure, or outline of individual objects. One of the most important things to remember about shape is the difference between straight geometrical features and curvy irregular features. Shapes with straight lines or edges are usually human-made. They normally represent urban or agricultural features. On the other side of the spectrum, the irregular curvy features are usually natural features, like rivers or forests. Sometimes rivers or forests will have straight portions, and that most likely indicates that humans have intervened there, like where a river is channeled and then dammed, or where forests have been cut down or roads have been built. Sometimes you will see circular shapes, usually in some shade of green, and that is where the land is being irrigated by a rotating sprinkler system. So what can you interpret about the location based on the shapes in this image? I would hypothesize that this area is largely rural, but urbanized enough to have two main roads or highways, and the land has been parceled off. There are also some natural water features like streams or rivers running through the area, particularly in the bottom left corner. Object size helps show scale and is particularly important to assess object size based on other objects in the image. You can also determine the absolute size, usually by identifying a feature that you know the measurements of, and then calculate the size based on the scale of the object in the image. For example, baseball diamonds are 90 feet on each side. So if an object measured twice as long as the baseball field in the image, you would know that it is 180 feet long. So what can you tell me about this area based on the sizes of the objects in this image? I can tell where the area is more urbanized. In the center of the image, you may notice that the sizes of the objects are much smaller. That is likely because they are a residential area or a small town. Think the suburbs. I can also tell that there are really only two main roads that go straight through the center of town because they are thicker than the other roads. If you were looking at a bigger city, you would be able to tell the differences between residential homes and industrial areas because of the differences in the size of the buildings. Pattern refers to the spatial arrangement of objects. This is normally a repetition of similar tones that make a distinctive pattern. For example, you can often tell the difference between a forest and an orchard by the pattern of rows and trees instead of having the trees irregularly placed like in a natural forest. So what can you figure out about this area based on the patterns within this image? Like with size, I can tell that the center of the image is more urbanized because it has a smaller grid-like pattern that indicates smaller parcels of land. I would also guess that this is a city that developed after the invention of cars because the roads are straight and more grid-like in pattern compared to older cities where the roads often spread out radially from the center of town. Texture refers to the arrangement and frequency of tonal variation throughout the image. As I mentioned before, areas that appear to look rougher have more changes happening within a smaller area, like a forest canopy. Smooth textures are usually of unvarying, even surfaces like asphalt or concrete. So what can you tell me the about this area based on the textures in this image? Like with the last two examples, the urban area in the center appears much more rough than the rest of the image, likely due to the variation between the buildings, yards, and roads. In conjunction with color, I can also tell which plots of land and within each plot of land have the areas that are more watered or have more groundwater close to the surface. Shadows are also helpful in interpretation because they can give you an idea about the relative height of targets. You can calculate this through some simple trigonometry, and if you would like to learn how, you can click on the link in the slide. Unfortunately, however, shadows can also reduce or eliminate the possibility of interpreting areas around them because the shadows may cover the objects. This is an image of Burj Khalifa, which is over 830 meters in height. It is the tallest building in the world, and that is the triangular point in the center. And then To the right, you have the Dubai Mall, which has an 8-meter dinosaur inside, as well as a skating rink and aquarium, and is the second largest mall in the world. Last but not least, association. Association considers the relationship between features in an image by considering which features are normally associated with the object you are interested in. What do you think this is an image of based on association? If you guessed that it's a school, you're correct. School buildings can look similar to apartment complexes, malls, or industrial centers. But because there is a football field with a track and tennis court next to it, it's most likely a school. To delve into this further, because the fields look well maintained with field markers, this is more likely to be a high school or college than an elementary or middle school. Also, looking at the football field, there is limited seating, which tells me that it is more likely to be a high school than a college because it hosts less people. The same is true for the classrooms. The campus is not that large, so it is more likely going to be a school that teaches only K through 12. Lastly, there is no obvious drop-off circle, and there's a decent amount of parking, which indicates that whoever goes there can drive themselves.